Okay, are you enjoying Photoshop so far? Are you having some fun? I hope you're having some fun here. I gotta show you something a little bit different from sort of the topics that we've been discussing up until this point. I want to talk about something inside Photoshop which you're gonna love if you've never heard of it before. It's called history. And, I may have mentioned it briefly earlier. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But essentially, you can think of your history inside Photoshop as like a mega undo, if you will. You know when you're going along in a program, any program really, and you want to step back one step, right? Well, of course, we just head up to the edit menu and choose undo. Now, I can't undo because I haven't performed any commands on my particular photo here. But normally you would just choose edit undo, or of course you would hit Control Z on the PC side or Command Z here on the Mac to undo. Now, as shocking as it may sound, Photoshop has one undo. So the image editing standard application across the entire world has one undo, if you can believe it. Well, many years ago, in a previous version of Photoshop, they introduced this thing called history, and essentially what it does is, again, it's kind of this idea of a mega undo. So the history is going to track everything that you do inside Photoshop. It's like Photoshop's history panel is watching you, and it's recording everything that you do. And then what you can do from that point is then you can go back in time, hence the term history. You can literally step backwards through all of your various steps if you want to undo. Now, enough babbling. Let me show you how this is actually going to work. Do you have your history panel open on screen? I hope you do. If not, of course, just head up to your window menu and look for history. And we see some weird stuff inside the history panel. We see our image there, barn1.jpg, and then open. So the history panel is already recording what you and I are doing here. We opened the file and it recorded that. That's fantastic. Now, what I'm going to do next is I want to throw on just a couple of really quick commands, and I'm going to get into some filters, and I'm going to throw on a color correction command here as well. We'll talk about filters, and we'll talk about special effects, and we'll talk about color correction in just a little while. I just want to throw a couple of quick commands onto my image because really this discussion is all about history, right? So here's what I'm going to do very quickly with you is I'm going to head up to the filter menu and then down to artistic. And again, don't get hung up on filters for now. And I'm just going to choose dry brush, and that's going to open me up into this massive dialog box. Let's not even concern ourselves with this dialog box. Just click on OK. That's all I want you to do. And you'll notice now inside the history palette, we have open, and then now we have dry brush. So the dry brush effect, or the dry brush command, has now been applied to our barn. Okay, let's keep moving here. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to filter, and this time I'm going to go down to brush strokes, and then I will choose angled strokes. Something like this, back into the same dialog box. Again, I'm just going to keep on moving here. I'll click on OK. And then, of course, now inside the history palette, we now have the dry brush and the angled strokes commands here. Let's do one more here. I'm going to go for my color correction command now. So back to the menu bar across the top. This time I'm going to head to the image menu, down to adjustments, and then over to brightness contrast. All I want you to do inside this brightness contrast dialog box is move the sliders around a little bit. Just do something like that. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. Go ahead and click on OK. All right. So now, inside the history panel, we have barn1.jpg across the top. We have open, we have dry brush, we have angled strokes, and we have the brightness contrast. So again, the history panel is watching. It's keeping an eye on everything that we're doing here. Now, what I could do at this point in the game is I could say, the brightness contrast, I'm not feeling it. I want to back up one step. Well, I could use my keyboard shortcut, Control Z or Command Z on my keyboard here, or I could head up to the edit menu and I could choose undo and then the name of the previous command that I just used. So in my case, brightness contrast. So I'm going to choose edit, undo brightness contrast. And what happens here is the command or the effect is removed from my image, and it's also removed from my history palette. Now, this is the part that I want to show you. Let's say I want to undo my angled strokes as well. I'm going to go back to the edit menu, and there is no undo angled strokes. There's only redo brightness contrast. So in other words, again, there's only one level of undo that we have available to us here inside Photoshop. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose Redo Brightness Contrast. And of course, what that does is that reapplies brightness contrast. I see brightness contrast now showing up inside the history palette as well. So it's kind of weird, but hopefully nothing too, earth-shattering here for you. Now, in the next exercise, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the history palette with you. Okay, now that we've applied some commands to our image, how can we now use history to step backwards in time and perhaps undo some of these effects? Well, it's actually really easy, as it turns out, thankfully. What we can do here is, if I want to get rid of the brightness contrast command and go back to angled strokes, all I need to do is just single click on angled strokes, and that removes the brightness contrast. Or I could go even further back in time by clicking on dry brush, and that takes me all the way back to how my image looked after I applied the dry brush effect, right? So the way that the history panel is organized here is we have the beginning of the timeline, if you will. I kind of think of it as a timeline anyway, at the top, and the ending of the timeline, or the current location on the timeline, if you will, at the bottom of the palette. So what I could do is I could use the history palette for a couple of neat techniques. For example, maybe I want to get sort of a before and after look at my image after I apply some color correction or after I apply some effects. So here I'm on brightness contrast again. I stepped forwards in time just by clicking on the last history state, as it's known. All of these blocks here are known as history states, or history steps, if you will. So I'm all the way forwards in time. And what I want to do is I want to do this sort of before and after comparison. So what I'll do is I'll click on the very first guy in the history palette, this guy here, barn1.jpg, and that takes me all the way back to how my image looked when I first opened it. This guy at the top here is what's referred to as a snapshot, kind of something that I want you to keep in the back of your mind just for a moment. So I click on the snapshot at the top of the history panel. This is how my barn looked when I first opened it. Then what I could do is I could click back on the last history state, or the last history step. Here's my after. So quite literally, before and after, just like that. And I go, I don't know if I like it or not, or maybe I should back up a couple of steps, this sort of thing, right? So you can do a lot of cool things here. You can step forwards and backwards in time, one step at a time, by using keyboard shortcuts. So give this a try. On the Windows side, hold down Alt and Control. On the Mac side here, I'm going to hold down Option and Command, and then hit your Z key on your keyboard. And that will step you backwards in time. And you can see inside my history palette, the states are reverting back to the previous state, right? So again, Control and Alt on the Windows side, Command and Option here on the Mac. Now, if you want to step forwards in time using your keyboard, try this. On the Windows side, hold down Control and Shift. Here on the Mac, I'll hold down Command and Shift, and then hit the Z key on your keyboard. And that will allow you to step forwards in time. Okay, I've got to show you a couple of other neat things here. Let's say, for example, that I'm really happy with where things are looking here with the last state here, the brightness contrast. What I can do is I can save this position in my document. Let's say I'm working along on my image, maybe again applying some effects or some color correction, and I get to a point where I really like it, but I might still tinker a little bit with the image. Well, I can save the current state, if you will, of my image. I can save it as this thing called a snapshot. How do I do that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to head up to the History Palette menu in the top right corner, and I'm simply going to choose New Snapshot. And I got a dialog box here, the New Snapshot dialog box. You can throw a name in there if you want. I'm just going to leave the default here, and I'll go ahead and click on OK. And then now at the top of the History Palette, we now have two snapshots. The first guy there, the default, Barn 1, and then Snapshot 1. So again, I can do this before and after comparison if I want, which is kind of cool. So there you go. You can always save your history states as snapshots, which is great. Now, a few other little tidbits that I want to bounce off you here related to history. I'm going to go all the way down to brightness contrast here, the very last history state. And then once again from the history menu, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open the history palette menu, I should say. And then this time I'm going to choose new document. And what this will do is this will create a new Photoshop file based on the current history state that I have selected here inside the history palette. So once again, back to the history palette menu there. I went and got out of mine, and I'll choose new document. And now I have a new file inside Photoshop. There are no history states except this default one here, the duplicate state here. And it's a completely new file that I can continue working on if I want. And the original barn1.jpg is still open in the background. Just click on your document tab there. You can see all the history states are there inside the history palette, all intact, which is awesome. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're really going to use history a lot. I use history a whole heck of a lot because I'm always making mistakes. Anyway, I hope this is all good for you here. I want to bounce one more thing off of you. He's kind of related to the issue of undoing, and he's kind of related to history as well. He's called reverting, and I'll show you that really quickly in the next exercise. I want to take just a couple of quick seconds and talk about Photoshop's revert command. And, you know, before we do that, we should maybe clean our screen up a little bit. I'm going to get rid of this extra file that you and I had just created in the previous exercise, so you can just flip back over to that file if you want and just click on the X on the document tab there just to close out of them. I'm not going to bother saving this guy. I suppose you can if you want, but it doesn't really matter. Okay. We have this command inside Photoshop called revert. Now, you might know about the revert command from some of your other applications that you might work with on a regular basis. Essentially, what the revert command will do is take us back to the last time that we saved our file. It would be the same as me closing out of the barn photograph here, not saving when Photoshop prompts me to save, and then simply reopening the document. Do you follow what I mean here? So I could go through all that if I wanted to. Or what I could do instead is I could just head up to Photoshop's File menu, and then I guess just about halfway down, just past halfway I should say, you'll find the revert command. Now, you can go ahead and choose that, or you can just hit F12 on your keyboard. Now, Mac users, you may need to reassign your system preferences keystrokes here, but normally myself, I remap all that stuff anyway. So I would just hit F12, but yourself here, you can choose File and then Revert. And essentially what that does is that takes us all the way back to the last time that we saved our file. Now, what's cool about using the Revert command, instead of closing out of the file, not saving, and then reopening the file, is that the Revert command shows up inside the History palette. So if I take a look over inside the History palette, there's my Revert command. So in other words, I could go, oh shoot, you know, I didn't mean to revert back. I wanted to continue where I'd left off. I can just back up one step and then continue on my merry way, right? So there you go. The revert command there, I really wanted to show you that, and I really wanted to show you history as well. And, you know, I will say this, there's even more to the history palette. I'm trying to keep it, you know, relatively short and sweet for you, but there's a couple of other very cool things that you can do with your history. And of course, don't forget that you can control the number of history states or the number of stored history steps that the history palette will store for you inside your preferences. Do you remember where that is? If you're on the Windows side, head to the Edit menu. Here on the Mac side, I'll head up to the Photoshop menu and then down to Preferences and then into Performance, and there we will have history states, and the default number of history steps or history states is 20. So in other words, once I get all the way down to 20, the history panel is going to run out of room, and what happens after I perform 21st step, if that makes sense, then it starts taking things off of the top of the history palette, if that makes sense. So I couldn't go back to open, I couldn't go back to dry brush, things like that. But anyway, there you go. There's your history panel. Well, I suppose we should have a discussion on saving files and understanding file formats and all that good stuff. You know, I could probably talk about file formats for about an hour and a half or 2 hours straight, but you'd be bored to death. So I'm going to try and give you the sort of the short and sweet crash course on file formats. I'm talking about JPEGs and TIFFs and when should I save my file as a GIF and when should I save my file as a PDF and all that kind of stuff. Now, I guess I should start the conversation here by saying, of course, and this really goes without saying, but as you're working along in Photoshop, save your work often. If Photoshop crashes or if your computer crashes, heaven forbid, you will lose all of your work and you can phone me and we can cry together, but there's really nothing that I can do to help you if you've lost your work. So save often. That goes without saying. I do want to say this, though. As we're going along and saving our work, Control-S or Command-S, by the way, is your keyboard shortcut. So every once in a while, I just hit Command-S or Control-S to save my work. But depending on the type of file that you're working on, for example, here we have barn1.jpg, so it's a JPEG file. As I'm working along inside Photoshop, and, as you and I start getting into the deeper aspects of Photoshop, layers and alpha channels and, adjustment layers and all this good stuff, if we save our JPEG, Photoshop is going to want to save our file as a Photoshop file, a .psd file. Why? Well, Photoshop's trying to help you out because not all file formats support all options, right? For example, a JPEG doesn't support Photoshop layers. JPEGs don't support Photoshop alpha channels either, right? This kind of thing. So Photoshop wants to make sure that your images remain as editable as possible. So you might see this every once in a while, and that's really the only reason why I'm mentioning it. I just don't want you to get confused here. Okay, how do I save my file into a different format? Very easy. Up to the File menu here, and then down to Save As. Now, of course, there are other methods for getting our stuff out of Photoshop and into other applications, but I'm just giving you the down and dirty here. So File, Save As, and then, of course, from the Format drop-down menu at the bottom of the dialog box, this is where we see the huge laundry list of file formats. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of these file formats with you here. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll point out the highlights, and I will kind of leave it at that, and hopefully that'll be all right with you. So the very first option that we have is a Photoshop file. As previously mentioned, a .psd Photoshop document file. And this is Photoshop's native file format. So pretty much everything I can do inside Photoshop would remain editable inside a Photoshop document or a .psd. So things like layers, alpha channels, adjustment layers, masks, all the good stuff, right? So what I would suggest you do is keep your files in the Photoshop format while you're working on them. And then if you need to post a version of your image online, for example, then save out a copy of your file in the appropriate file format. If you need your image in a print layout and you need to save out a copy, then save out a copy in a proper file format. So in other words, you're always working from the same original source, right? Anyway, there's the Photoshop native file format, the first guy there. BMP, don't use it. Otherwise, I will come to your house and take away your computer. Don't use .bmps. They're terrible. They're low quality. They really shouldn't even exist. Anyway, we have CompuServe GIF, and we have JPEG and PNG down towards the bottom. These guys are all siblings. So again, GIF, JPEG, and PNG. These guys are our three primary file formats, image file formats that we would want to use in web design. Now, I'll spare you the nuts and bolts beyond that. So JPEGs and PNGs and GIFs are used nearly exclusively online. But JPEGs are also used quite often, when you're emailing friends the photos you took on your vacation, that kind of thing. So a JPEG is a really good file format for just getting your stuff around, whether it's through email or onto Facebook or this kind of thing. There's another file format here called Photoshop EPS. I'm really not sure if this format is really even used anymore. We used to use this file format a lot in the print world back in the days of Quark Express, but I really don't think it's used that much anymore. But anyway, it is an option. You might see EPS's .EPS files come up every once in a while. And of course, everybody knows about PDF files. Now, did you know that you could save out your images, your Photoshop documents as PDFs? Sure can. All you need to do is just choose Photoshop PDF from the drop-down menu here, click on Save, and that's all she wrote. Then you can open up the file inside Acrobat or email it to a coworker and they can open it up inside Acrobat. Either the full Acrobat editing software or if they just have Acrobat Reader. It's great. Okay, good stuff. I already mentioned PNG or PNG files, so I'll leave that one. The last one that I want to mention is TIFF. And again, a TIFF file is kind of like I will say a more professional version of JPEG. It's a great way for getting your images around. I think of TIFF as like a Jeep. It's really rugged, it's durable, it's going to get you around. But it's really more used in professional circles. So if I wanted to send a print house my file and I want to make sure they can open it up, I would send the file to them as a TIFF. Or if I'm going to get my photographer to send me some files, I'm going to ask for TIFFs because guaranteed I can open up his files inside Photoshop. Okay, I just gave you the super fast run through. If you want to take a moment and try saving your file out under different file formats, comparing file sizes and things like this, go for it. Myself, I'm just going to cancel out of this dialog box. There's a new productivity panel inside Photoshop CS5 called Mini Bridge. Now, I don't know if you've explored this on your own or not, but it's definitely cool. Now, before I start talking about Mini Bridge, let me ask you this. Do you know about ADOBE Bridge, the file organizer application? It comes bundled with the Creative Suite, and I believe it comes bundled with the standalone Photoshop application as well. And quite literally, it allows you to sort and organize your images, but it'll let you do a whole heck of a lot more than that. It'll allow you to apply metadata to your photos. It'll allow you to apply ratings to your photos, all kinds of different things. I'm really not doing it justice here, but in any regard, what I'm going to do here from the application bar right across the top of the interface here is I could click on this guy here, Launch Bridge, or right next door we have Launch Mini Bridge. So going into Launch Bridge opens up the full ADOBE Bridge application, which is great. You're more than welcome to explore that on your own. But what I want to show you is this Mini Bridge panel. So go ahead and click on Launch Mini Bridge. And then over towards the right-hand side of our screen, we now have the Mini Bridge panel opening up for us. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to go ahead and click on Browse Files, this icon here, and that brings me into this view here. Now, I'm not sure what you're going to see on your side. I want to try and make sure that we're going to see the same thing here. What I want to do is I want to see my project files for our course here. So what I'm going to do is I put mine on my desktop. I have no idea where you put yours. So I'm going to navigate to my desktop. You can see in the top here we have this little sort of this navigator area. You know, as a matter of fact, hang on one sec. I'm just going to tear away this palette just by dragging on the Mini Bridge tab there. And I'm just going to stretch things out just so I have a little bit more elbow room in here. So what we have here is in the left-hand column, we have things like favorites and recent folders and collections, recent files, and so on. A particular navigation technique that we have available in the full bridge as well. And then over in the right-hand column, we have our computer structure. So there's my computer, there's my user account, the desktop, the documents and pictures. So I said that I put my project files on the desktop. So if I click on the desktop, then I see the two folders on my desktop. I'm going to double click on my project files folder, and that brings me into, of course, my project files. Now, as you can see, they're all in there. You might want to scroll around a little bit. There's lots of good stuff in there, lots of images to get to. And essentially all Mini Bridge is a file browser. That's really kind of it. Now, there's lots of different things that we can do in terms of organizing our view and sorting our view if we want. For example, I can use the slider down in the bottom left corner to either increase or decrease the size of my images. That's certainly possible. That's entirely up to you if you want to do that. And then over towards the right, we have two drop-down menus. We have our preview drop-down menu here, so I could say, give me a slideshow, or give me the review mode if I want. Or next door to him, in the extreme bottom right corner, we can view as thumbnails, we can view as a film strip, details. Let's go details here. So now I get some information about the particular files, when it was created, the file size, the document type, and so on. It's really entirely up to you. And I'm sure on your own you'd be fine figuring out most of this stuff. I'm just kind of giving you the quick run through here. And then towards the middle right, we have another series of icons here, more ways to go about organizing and sorting your view here. I can show hidden files, I can select all my files, this sort of thing. I can filter my view if I want based on perhaps star rating or, things like this. All kinds of different options, right? And of course, if there's a file inside Mini Bridge that I want to open up, all I need to do is just double click on them and that'll open them up inside Photoshop. So if I get my Mini Bridge out of the way there, and I'll just collapse them down there just by clicking on that white double-headed arrow. There's my barn2.jpg, the file that I happen to double-click on. But anyway, there you go. There's sort of a quick run-through, a quick down-and-dirty look at Mini Bridge. It's entirely up to you if you want to use this guy or not. I find myself, I'm finding I use him more and more. The more I use Photoshop CS5, the more I'm turning to Mini Bridge. Call me lazy, but choosing file open is, I don't know, a little too cumbersome for me these days. But anyway, there you go, Mini Bridge.